Good afternoon. Thousands of troops from NATO have poured over the border into Kosovo. It's the biggest military operation seen in Europe since the Second World War. British paratroopers were the first of the NATO-led peacekeeping force to reach Pristina airport, where there's now a tense standoff. They've come face to face with Russian troops who marched into the capital without warning. ITN has 3 correspondents in Kosovo. Our first report is from James Mates, who travelled across Kosovo ahead of the first wave of British troops.
The orders were to go in at dawn. The Paras and the Gurkhas of Britain's 5th Armoured Brigade were ready. Shortly after 5 a.m, the roar of the first helicopters overhead told them their commanders had given the signal to go. Chinooks and Pumas carried the first units across the border into Kosovo, some with vehicles slung under their bellies, others laden with the men who would secure the first bridgeheads. And alongside, riding shotgun, their escorts, the American Apache helicopters, now entering potentially hostile territory for the first time in this war. As the helicopters passed over, the first motorized units rolled through the frontier posts into Kosovo. It was 24 hours later than planned. Events further north had robbed them of the honor of being the first foreign troops in, but NATO's peaceful occupation of the province had begun. The capital, Pristina, lay just 40 miles away. But each mile had to be cleared of mines, booby traps or unexploded munitions left over from the air war. And as each mile was secured, the heavy armour rolled through, a force sufficiently powerful that once in place, no one is going to challenge NATO's grip on this province. Challenger tanks, warriors, scimitar armoured cars, an array of British firepower not mobilised in Europe since World War II. According to plan, by day's end, this force of heavy armour was rolling through the outskirts of Pristina. By the end of today, NATO will have established itself here. The symbolism is unmistakable. NATO now runs Kosovo. James Mates, ITN, with the British Army in Pristina.
Well, I'm joined now by James Mates in Pristina. James, NATO's progress to Pristina seems to have been remarkably smooth.
Remarkably smooth until, in fact, about 45 minutes ago, when the heavens opened here, there was a most torrential thunder and hailstorm, and that in many ways has brought the advance to a bit of a halt. As you can see, we're right here on the outskirts of Pristina, and this is where, for the most part, the British armour has got as well. Now, it was planning to move into the city tonight, but it's growing dark, so it's possible that it won't, because it doesn't want, for obvious reasons, to move into a city where a potentially hostile environment after dark. But with that aside, the operation here, the British operation certainly that I've watched today, really has lived up to the term military precision. All the NATO plans to get the armour in, to get the advance guards in, to leapfrog people across one another with helicopters, they have all worked smoothly. The only complication obviously has been with the Russians at the airport.
You have now spent the whole day travelling through Kosovo. It's the first time we've really seen inside the province. How would you describe it?
Well, a really curious contrast through the journey. To start with, the province was completely empty, burnt out, empty houses, no people, no livestock, no crops anywhere, a really eerie silence about it. And then we hit an area where a number of Kosovo Albanians had obviously been hiding out throughout this war, and they all came out and swarmed to the side of the road. A tremendous welcome, waves and kisses for the NATO troops, waving to everybody who went by. And then as we approached Pristina here, an area where many Serbs still live, surly indifference from the population, a real contrast. There are still Serb armoured cars and troops around watching NATO progress through. They were understandably not looking too happy at the situation. From the people, occasional shouts of abuse and shouts of defiance, but for the most part just indifference. So really a land of contrasts.
James Mates, thank you very much. Well, ITN's Mark Austin was among the first to come across the border. He joined the Gurkhas as they were airlifted into Kosovo at dawn. Later, he followed the first reconnaissance troops as they entered Pristina.
British armour on the road to Pristina tonight, and for the first time in months, the people who have suffered so much here have something to celebrate. The few Kosovo Albanians left in this province came out to welcome NATO's troops as liberating heroes. From their burnt-out houses they waved. These are people who can now see an end to their agony. This was D-Day for British forces in Kosovo, and just after dawn this morning, a fleet of Chinook and Puma helicopters took off laden with paratroopers and Gurkhas. we joined the first wave of Gurkhas to fly in. It was a tense operation. As the helicopter touched down, Gurkha troops took up positions by the roadside. And then we came across an extraordinary confrontation as the Gurkhas came across a group of Serb policemen, stopped them and asked them to hand over their weapons. Their commander refused.
He's got 2 minutes to hand over his weapons, and then we will use force to take the weapons.
NATO's robust rules of engagement allow them to do this, and today they were strictly enforced. The road was soon lined with the AK-47 rifles of the Serb police. They are the weapons with which the Yugoslav police have terrorized the Kosovo Albanians here. Handing them over is a symbol of their humiliation. This evening, British forces were fighting their own troops on the way to Pristina. And what remains of the Serb army here could only watch as Kosovo came under NATO control. Mark Austin, ITN, Pristina.
Just a few minutes ago, I spoke to ITN's Julian Mannion, who's at Pristina Airport, where that standoff with the Russians is taking place. So, Julian, what is happening now in Pristina with this whole situation with the Russians?
Well, I've just come back from the edge of the airport, where an extremely complex and potentially dramatic situation is unfolding. I was with the British Advance Guard, the force led by Brigadier Freer, consisting of a large number of warrior and scimitar armoured cars and a large number of paratroopers and Gurkhas in open trucks behind them. And what has taken place is that Brigadier Freer, a short time ago, went into the airport to negotiate with the Russians, apparently to try to take control of the airport or at least to reach some accommodation with them. And you'll recall that all this stemmed from what happened last night, when in the middle of the night, a large convoy of Russian armour and troops suddenly arrived in the middle of Pristina to an ecstatic welcome from the Serbian population here, rumbled slowly through the town. There was flag waving, people threw flowers, jumped on the tanks, and then went to the airport and secured it. And it's this problem that Brigadier Freer is now trying to unlock. And I should make one further point, which is that in the area where the British column at the moment is, which is an area of burnt-out villages and country roads, there is a very large number of Yugoslav troops still present, in fact, very close to the column on both sides of it.
So conditions very difficult for British troops tonight?
They are going to be difficult, they're going to be tense, and above all, they're going to be really physically unpleasant. Because as I say, most of the troops are still out in the countryside, in these burnt-out villages, near the airport, and at the same time, the heavens have opened, and we've had not only a torrential rain shower, but hail as well. The weather could not really be worse. And it's these kind of conditions that the British troops are going to have to put up with to complete their mission.
Julian Mannion, thank you very much indeed. Tense negotiations are now going on in Moscow as the United States and Russia try to clarify Russia's role in the peacekeeping force. The Defence Secretary George Robertson said today that the premature arrival of Russian forces in Pristina was of no great consequence. But in Washington, it caused confusion and alarm. Here's ITN's Robert Moore.
It remains an extraordinary sight today. The Russian military convoy still in Kosovo, showing no signs of pulling back. It appears that troops were ordered into the province by military hardliners in Moscow and without the knowledge of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Not only does it hint of a major political struggle in Russia, but also complicates NATO's effort to establish a clear command structure for all troops pouring into Kosovo. In Moscow, President Yeltsin was attending Independence Day ceremonies, while the Americans and Russians engaged in urgent talks to try and end the confusion. The Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov has said it was all a mistake and the Russian troops would pull out, but it seems he is being kept in the dark or outmaneuvered by military hawks. The West, although clearly stunned by these twists, was trying hard to talk the drama down.
I don't think it's a matter of great consequence that a small number of Russian troops allowed their enthusiasm for joining the peacekeepers to overcome their military discipline.
But if the Russian gesture was intended to reassure Kosovo's ethnic Serb population, it doesn't seem to be working. Serbs continue to flee Kosovo in the aftermath of Belgrade's military withdrawal. The immediate diplomatic push now is to try and end the confusion and potential dangers that flow from that dramatic unilateral Russian move into Kosovo. After so much intricate planning, it was the one action the West had not anticipated. Robert Moore, ITN.
Robert Moore joins me now. Robert, The Russians arriving early in Pristina, now this dramatic situation at the airport. Is it symbolic purely, or is it something more serious?
Well, it's purely symbolic in terms of the numbers involved. We're talking several hundred Russians compared to tens of thousands of NATO troops. But it's serious and potentially very serious in terms of it jeopardising the clarity of the command structure. Let's remember this is a complex multinational military operation involving complex politics and complex logistics. NATO is determined that there is not the ambiguity and confusion that might undermine the confidence of the refugees in the days before they return.
So what role then should Russia be playing in the whole peacekeeping situation?
Well, there's some fairly frantic diplomacy going on right now in Moscow to try and establish that. The model is, of course, Bosnia, where the Russians have some autonomy. They report, for example, to their own general, but they work to a unified chain of command. But what the West is absolutely determined does not happen is that the Russians establish their own zone of control, which might lead to, in effect, partition of Kosovo.
Robert Moore, thank you for that. Well, as news of the military operation spread, thousands of jubilant ethnic Albanians in refugee camps along the borders were celebrating and preparing to go home. ITN's Bill Neely sent this report from Kukej.
In row upon row of tents and beyond, 400,000 refugees are ready. The engines tested, they're ready to load up the little they have and reclaim their homeland. There were smiles today now that NATO is in Kosovo, but fear as well, because the Russians are there too. The Russians are just like Milosevic, he says. We've never liked them. We're nervous now because we're not safe to go back to our homes with Russians there. But another force came today to make them safe, the German army. 1,500 men and all the hardware of war, the advance guard for thousands more. This German army will occupy southern Kosovo, as a very different German army did half a century ago. This time, though, they will be welcomed by the local people into an area which has seen some of the bitterest fighting of this war. And these refugees, above all, will be glad to leave the camps. Last night, they escaped death by a fraction. This British Hercules transport plane crashed just a few hundred yards from their camp, exploding after a failed takeoff. No one in the camps or on the plane was killed. The explosion sent this refugee into labor. This morning her baby was born. It's now called freedom. Victory is what they're now proclaiming as they gear up to follow NATO home. Bill Neely, ITN, on the Kosovo-Albanian border.
Other news now, a top Russian fighter plane has crashed at the Paris Air Show. The Sukhoi 30 came down 3 minutes into its flight. Witnesses said the plane scraped the ground coming out of a dive. The two pilots ejected safely. Nobody was hurt. ITN's Trevor MacDonald has been